Imagine this. You've saved up for months, maybe even years, to treat yourself to a luxurious first-class flight. You're seated in a plush leather seat, the cabin is quiet, and the soft hum of the engine lulls you into a sense of calm. You're ready to sip on a glass of champagne, the kind of indulgence you've been dreaming about. But then something happens, something that makes your heart sink, your pride sting, and your blood boil. This isn't just a story about a flight gone wrong. It's a story about dignity, justice, and the power of standing up for yourself. This is the story of a black woman who was denied champagne in first class, and how one phone call turned the tables in ways no one could have predicted. It all started on a seemingly ordinary day. Let's call her Naomi. Naomi was a successful entrepreneur, a woman who had worked tirelessly to build her business from the ground up. She was used to breaking barriers, but she never expected to face one at 30,000 feet in the air. Naomi had booked a first-class ticket as a gift to herself, celebration of her hard work and a moment to relax. She boarded the plane, settled into her seat, and waited for the flight attendant to offer her the customary glass of champagne. But when the attendant approached, something felt off. The attendant's smile was tight, her tone clipped. And then, it happened. Naomi was told in no uncertain terms that she couldn't be served champagne. The reason? It was unclear, but the implication was crystal clear. She didn't belong there. Naomi's heart raced. Was this really happening? She looked around the cabin. Other passengers were sipping their drinks, laughing, and enjoying the luxury she had paid for. But she was being treated differently. She felt the weight of every eye on her. The silent judgment. The unspoken assumptions. But Naomi wasn't the type to stay silent. She had faced adversity before, and she knew how to fight back. With a calm that belied the storm inside her, she pulled out her phone. What happened next would change everything. The call she made wasn't long, but it was powerful. She spoke with a quiet intensity, her words measured but firm. She didn't raise her voice, but her message was clear. This wasn't just about a glass of champagne. It was about respect, equality, and the right to be treated with dignity. The person on the other end of the line listened intently, and by the time Naomi hung up, the wheels of justice were already in motion. Within minutes, the flight attendant who had denied her service was called to the front of the plane. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers exchanged glances, whispering to each other. What was going on? What had Naomi done? But before we get to that, let's rewind for a moment. Who was Naomi really? She wasn't just a passenger on a plane, she was a force to be reckoned with. A woman who had built her success through sheer determination and an unshakable belief in herself. She had faced countless obstacles in her life, but she had always risen above them. This moment on the plane was no different. It was a test, and Naomi was determined to pass it with flying colors. But as the flight attendant walked back to her seat, her face pale and her hands trembling, Naomi knew this wasn't over. The story was just beginning. What happened next would shock everyone on that plane. The flight attendant was escorted off, her career hanging by a thread. But for Naomi, this wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. It was about sending a message that discrimination, in any form, would not be tolerated. As the plane taxied down the runway, Naomi sat back in her seat, her glass of champagne finally in hand. But her mind was already racing ahead. What would happen when the plane landed? How would the airline respond? And most importantly, what would this moment mean for her and for others who had faced similar treatment? The answers to those questions would come later. For now, the story ends here on a cliffhanger, with the tension still thick in the air. But one thing is certain. Naomi's journey was far from over. And as the plane soared into the sky, so did her determination to make sure that no one else would ever have to go through what she did. Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, Naomi stared out the window, the clouds below a blur of white against the deep blue. The champagne glass in her hand felt cold, the bubbles rising to the surface in a quiet fizz. She took a sip, the crisp taste a small victory, but her mind was far from at ease. The confrontation with the flight attendant had left a bitter aftertaste, one that no amount of champagne could wash away. She replayed the moment in her head, the way the attendant's eyes had flickered with something she couldn't quite place. Was it discomfort, judgment, or something deeper, something more insidious? Naomi wasn't sure, but she knew one thing. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Naomi's story didn't start on that plane. It started years earlier, in a small town where opportunities were scarce and dreams often felt out of reach. She had grown up watching her mother work double shifts just to put food on the table. Her father had left when she was young, and the weight of responsibility had fallen on her shoulders early. But Naomi had always been a fighter. She had a fire in her that refused to be extinguished, no matter how hard life tried to blow it out. She worked her way through college, taking on odd jobs and late-night shifts to pay her tuition. It wasn't easy, but she never complained. She knew that every sacrifice was a step closer to the life she wanted, a life where she could stand tall, unapologetically herself. By the time she founded her own company, Naomi had already overcome more than most people could imagine. Her business, a tech startup focused on creating affordable software for small businesses, was her pride and joy. It wasn't just a company to her. It was a testament to her resilience, her ability to turn obstacles into opportunities. But even as her success grew, she never forgot where she came from. She made it a point to mentor young women, especially women of color who were trying to break into industries that often felt closed off to them. She knew what it was like to be the only one in the room who looked like her, and she was determined to change that. So when she booked that first-class ticket, it wasn't just a treat. It was a symbol of how far she'd come. She had earned this moment, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it away from her. But as she sat there, the soft hum of the plane's engine filling the silence, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The flight attendant had been escorted off, but the ripple effects of what had happened were just beginning. Naomi knew that her phone call had set something in motion, but she didn't yet know how far it would go. Behind the scenes, the airline was scrambling. The person Naomi had called was a high-ranking executive, someone she had met at a networking event years earlier. They hadn't spoken in a while, but when Naomi's name popped up on their phone, they knew it was serious. Naomi wasn't the type to make a fuss over nothing. The executive listened as Naomi recounted what had happened, their jaw tightening with every word. By the time the call ended, they were already drafting an email to the airline's HR department. This wasn't just about one flight attendant. It was about a culture that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. Meanwhile, back on the plane, the atmosphere was tense. Passengers whispered to each other, casting curious glances in Naomi's direction. Some were sympathetic, their faces etched with concern. Others seemed annoyed, as if the disruption had inconvenienced them more than the injustice itself. Naomi ignored them, focusing instead on the task at hand. She pulled out her laptop and began typing, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She wasn't just going to let this slide. She was going to make sure that the airline and anyone else who thought they could treat people this way understood that there would be consequences. As the flight continued, Naomi's mind wandered. Back to the flight attendant. She wondered what had led her to act the way she did. Was it ignorance? Prejudice? Or was she just following orders, caught in a system that perpetuated inequality? Naomi didn't have the answers, but she knew that whatever the reason, it wasn't an excuse. People had to be held accountable for their actions, especially when those actions hurt others. But as much as she believed in accountability, she also believed in second chances. She hoped that this incident would be a wake-up call, not just for the flight attendant but for the airline as a whole. By the time the plane began its descent, Naomi had a plan. She wasn't going to let this moment define her, but she was going to use it to make a difference. She knew that her story would resonate with people, that it would spark conversations, and maybe even inspire change. But she also knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be pushback, criticism, and maybe even threats. But Naomi wasn't afraid. She had faced worse, and she had always come out stronger on the other side. As the wheels touched down, Naomi took a deep breath. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. She gathered her things, her mind already racing with the next steps. She would reach out to her network, share her story, and demand action. But for now, she needed to focus on the present. She stepped off the plane, the cool air of the jet bridge a welcome relief. The airport was bustling, a sea of people rushing to their gates. But Naomi moved with purpose. She had a mission, and nothing was going to stand in her way. But as she walked through the terminal, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat as she read the message. It was from the executive she had spoken to earlier. The words were brief, but they sent a chill down her spine. "We need to talk. It's bigger than we thought." Naomi's mind raced. What did that mean? What had they uncovered? She quickened her pace, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Whatever was coming next, she was ready. But as she stepped into the bright light of the arrivals hall, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real storm was just beginning. Naomi's fingers tightened around her phone as she read the message again. "We need to talk. It's bigger than we thought." Her mind raced with possibilities. What could be bigger than a flight attendant denying her service? She had assumed it was an isolated incident, a moment of bias that could be addressed with a stern conversation and some sensitivity training. But the tone of the message suggested something deeper, something more systemic. She quickly typed a reply. "I'm listening. When and where?" The response came almost instantly. "Meet me at the Skyline Lounge in 30 minutes. Come alone." The Skyline Lounge was one of the airline's exclusive VIP spaces, a place where high-profile passengers and executives could relax away from the chaos of the main terminal. Naomi had been there once before during a business trip, but this time felt different. This wasn't a casual meeting. It was a summons. She made her way through the airport, her thoughts swirling. What had the executive uncovered? And why did they want her to come alone? She couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something much larger than herself. When she arrived at the lounge, the executive was already waiting. Let's call him Daniel. Daniel was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, with a sharp suit and an even sharper gaze. He greeted Naomi with a handshake, but his usual confident demeanor was tinged with unease. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice low. "We need to talk somewhere private." He led her to a secluded corner of the lounge, away from prying eyes. Once they were seated, he leaned in, his expression serious. "What happened on that plane wasn't an isolated incident," he began. "We've been getting complaints for months, passengers of color being treated differently, especially in first class. But every time we tried to investigate, the trail went cold. Until now?" Naomi's stomach churned. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was still a shock. "So what changed?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Daniel hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "Your call," he said finally. "It was the final push we needed to dig deeper. We started looking into the flight attendant's record, and what we found, let's just say it's not good. She's been involved in multiple incidents, but they were all swept under the rug. And she's not the only one. There's a pattern here, Naomi. A culture of discrimination that goes way beyond one employee." Naomi leaned back in her chair, processing the information. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every passenger who had ever been made to feel unwelcome. Every person who had been denied the respect they deserved. "What are you going to do about it?" she asked, her tone firm. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "That's the problem. We want to do the right thing, but it's complicated. There are people in the company who don't want this to come out. They're worried about the backlash, the lawsuits, the damage to our reputation, but I can't let this go. Not after what happened to you. Not after what's been happening to so many others." Naomi nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then let me help," she said. "I have a platform. I can share my story, bring attention to what's going on. But I need to know you're serious about making changes. This can't just be about saving face." Daniel met her gaze, his expression earnest. I am serious, he said. But it's not going to be easy. There are powerful people who will fight this every step of the way. If we're going to do this, we need to be smart, and we need to be ready for whatever comes next. As they spoke, Naomi couldn't help but notice the way Daniel's eyes kept darting to the entrance of the lounge. It was subtle, but it was there, a flicker of unease, as if he was expecting someone. She followed his gaze, but the lounge was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of conversation and the clink of glasses. Still, the tension in the air was palpable. Something was off, and Naomi couldn't quite put her finger on it. Before she could ask, Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his face paling slightly. I need to take this, he said, standing abruptly. Stay here. I'll be right back. He walked away, leaving Naomi alone with her thoughts. She replayed their conversation in her head, trying to make sense of it all. A culture of discrimination, complaints being swept under the rug, powerful people trying to keep it quiet. It was a lot to take in, but one thing was clear. This was bigger than she had imagined, and if Daniel was right, the fight was just beginning. She waited. Naomi's phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from her assistant letting her know that her story was already starting to gain traction online. Someone on the plane had recorded the incident and posted it on social media. The video was going viral, with thousands of comments and shares. Naomi's heart raced as she scrolled through the responses. Some were supportive, praising her for standing up for herself. Others were critical, accusing her of making a big deal out of nothing. And then there were the hateful comments, the ones that made her stomach turn. She knew this was part of the territory, but it didn't make it any easier to read. Before she could respond, Daniel returned, his face grim. We have a problem, he said, sitting down across from her. The video of the incident has gone viral. The higher-ups are panicking. They want to issue a statement, but they're worried about saying the wrong thing. They've asked me to handle it, but I need your input. How do you want to proceed? Naomi took a deep breath, her mind racing. This was her chance to take control of the narrative to make sure her story was told the right way, but it was also a risk. Once she put herself out there was no turning back. I'll do it, she said finally. I'll share my story, but on my terms. No sugarcoating, no spin, just the truth. Daniel nodded, but his expression was still troubled. There's something else, he said. The flight attendant, she's gone missing. No one's heard from her since she was escorted off the plane. And there are rumors that she's not the only one who's been silenced. Naomi's blood ran cold. What had she gotten herself into? And more importantly, who else was involved? As the weight of the situation settled over her, Naomi realized that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about uncovering the truth no matter how ugly it was. And it was about holding people accountable, no matter how powerful they were. But as she looked at Daniel, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he wasn't telling her. Something darker. Something more dangerous. And as the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room grew thicker, the air heavy with unspoken questions and unresolved fears. The fight was far from over. In fact, it was just getting started. And Naomi knew that whatever came next, it would change everything. Naomi's heart pounded as she stared at Daniel, the weight of his words sinking in. The flight attendant was missing, rumors of others being silenced. This wasn't just about discrimination anymore. It was about something far more sinister. The air in the Skyline Lounge felt heavy, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. Naomi leaned forward, her voice low but firm. What aren't you telling me, Daniel? If we're going to do this, I need to know everything. No more secrets. Daniel hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if someone might be listening. He leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. There's a group within the company, a small but powerful faction, that's been covering up these incidents for years. They've got connections, resources, and they're not afraid to use them. When I started digging, I found out that this isn't just about a few bad apples. It's a system. And the people at the top, they'll do whatever it takes to protect it. Naomi's mind raced. She had expected pushback, maybe even some resistance, but this was something else entirely. "So, what are we dealing with?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her chest. "Are we talking about threats, intimidation, what?" Daniel's expression darkened. "All of the above and worse. There's a reason those complaints went nowhere. People who spoke up, they disappeared, transferred, fired, or worse. I don't want to scare you, Naomi, but you need to understand what you're up against." Naomi sat back, her mind spinning. She had faced challenges before, but this was different. This wasn't just about standing up for herself. It was about taking on a system that had been operating in the shadows for who knows how long. And now, with the video of the incident going viral, she was squarely in their crosshairs. "What do you suggest we do?" she asked, her voice calm but resolute. "We can't just let this go, not now." Daniel nodded, his expression grim. "We need evidence. Hard proof that can't be ignored. I've been trying to gather it, but it's risky. If they find out what I'm doing." He trailed off. But the implication was clear. Naomi understood the stakes. This wasn't just about her career or even her safety. It was about justice, for her, for the passengers who had been wronged, and for anyone else who had been silenced. "I'll help," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes. But we need to move fast. If they're as powerful as you say, they're already working to cover their tracks." As they spoke, Naomi's phone buzzed again. It was a notification from a news outlet. The video of the incident had made headlines, and the story was spreading like wildfire. She scrolled through the comments, her stomach churning at the mix of support and vitriol. Some people were calling for accountability while others accused her of exaggerating or even fabricating the story. But what caught her attention was a message from an unknown number. "Stop digging. You don't know what you're messing with." Naomi showed the message to Daniel, her hands trembling slightly. "They're already coming after me," she said, her voice tight. Daniel's jaw clenched as he read the message. "This is what I was afraid of," he said. "They're trying to scare you off, but if we back down now, they win. We need to stay ahead of them." He pulled out a flash drive and slid it across the table to her. "This has everything I've gathered so far. Emails, reports, names. It's not enough to take them down, but it's a start. Keep it safe, and whatever you do, don't let anyone know you have it." Naomi took the flash drive, her fingers closing around it tightly. It felt like holding a piece of dynamite. Powerful, but dangerous. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Daniel leaned in, his voice low and urgent. "We need to get this to someone who can help. Someone outside the company. A journalist, maybe, or a lawyer. Someone who can't be silenced. But we have to be careful. If they find out we're working together, it's over for both of us." Naomi nodded, her mind racing. She knew a few journalists who might be willing to take on a story like this, but reaching out to them would be risky. And then there was the matter of staying safe. If these people were willing to threaten her over a text message, what else were they capable of? "I'll reach out to someone I trust," she said finally. "But we need to be smart about this. No emails, no phone calls. We meet in person, somewhere public but discreet." Daniel agreed, but the tension between them was palpable. They both knew the risks, but they also knew they couldn't back down. As they finalized their plan, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every glance, every whisper in the lounge felt like a potential threat. She glanced at her phone again, the message from the unknown number still glaring up at her. "Stop digging." The words felt like a challenge, a dare, and Naomi had never been one to back down from a fight. As they left the lounge, Naomi and Daniel went their separate ways, each lost in their own thoughts. Naomi's mind was a whirlwind of fear, anger, and determination. She knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but she also knew she couldn't turn back now. Too much was at stake. She clutched the flash drive in her pocket, her fingers brushing against it like a talisman. It was a small thing, but it held the power to change everything. But as she stepped out into the bustling airport, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. Every shadow seemed to move. Every face seemed to linger a little too long. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. She needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere she could think. But as she turned a corner, she froze. Standing there, blocking her path, was a man in a dark suit. His expression was unreadable, but his presence sent a chill down her spine. "Ms. Naomi," he said, his voice smooth but cold. "We need to talk." Naomi's breath caught in her throat. She glanced around, but the corridor was empty. No one was coming to help her. She took a step back, her mind racing. What did he want? Was he here to threaten her? To silence her? Or worse? She tightened her grip on the flash drive, her only lifeline in this dangerous game. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I'm here to deliver a message," he said, taking a step closer. "You've made a lot of noise, Ms. Naomi, and some very powerful people are concerned. They want you to understand the consequences of your actions." Naomi's heart raced as she took another step back, her mind scrambling for a way out. But before she could react, the man reached into his jacket and her world went dark. The last thing she remembered was the sound of his voice, cold and final. "This is your last warning." And then, nothing. Naomi's eyes fluttered open, her head throbbing as if someone had taken a hammer to it. The world around her was blurry, disorienting. She blinked, trying to make sense of where she was. The cold, hard surface beneath her told her she was no longer in the airport. The air smelled damp, metallic, and the faint hum of machinery echoed in the distance. She tried to move, but her hands were bound tightly behind her back, the rough texture of rope digging into her skin. Panic surged through her as she realized she was in some kind of storage room, or worse, a warehouse. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. The man in the suit, his cold smile, the flash drive. She instinctively reached for her pocket, but it was empty. They had taken it. Her heart sank. All the evidence, all the names, everything Daniel had risked to give her, gone. But then she remembered something. Before leaving the lounge, she had slipped the flash drive into her shoe, a last-minute decision born out of paranoia. It was still there, pressed against the arch of her foot. A small victory, but it gave her hope. The sound of footsteps snapped her back to reality. Heavy boots clanged against the floor, growing louder as they approached. Naomi's breath quickened, her mind scrambling for a plan. She couldn't let them know she was awake. She closed her eyes, forcing her body to go limp, her breathing slow and steady. The door creaked open and she could feel the presence of someone standing over her. A man's voice, low and gruff, broke the silence. "She's still out." "Boss said to keep her here until he figures out what to do with her." Another voice, higher pitched and nervous, replied. "You think she knows anything? I mean, if she's just some random passenger, why go through all this trouble?" The first man chuckled, a sound that sent chills down Naomi's spine. "She's not random. She's the one who called in the big guns. If she's got what we think she's got, this could blow up in our faces. Boss isn't taking any chances." Naomi's mind raced. They didn't know about the flash drive in her shoe. They thought they had everything. That was her advantage, but she needed to act fast. She waited until the footsteps faded, the door closing with a heavy thud. Slowly, she opened her eyes, scanning the room. It was dimly lit with stacks of crates and boxes lining the walls. A single flickering bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows. Her hands were tied, but her feet were free. She wiggled her toes, feeling the flash drive still secure in her shoe. Now she just needed to get out. She shifted her weight, trying to sit up without making noise. Her head still pounded, but she pushed through the pain, focusing on the task at hand. She spotted a jagged piece of metal sticking out from one of the crates nearby. If she could reach it, she might be able to cut the ropes. She inched her way across the floor, her movements slow and deliberate. Every sound made her freeze, her heart pounding in her chest. but the room remained silent, the only noise the distant hum of machinery. Finally, she reached the crate. She twisted her body, positioning her hands so the ropes rubbed against the sharp edge of the metal. It was slow, agonizing work, but she didn't stop. Every second counted. As she worked, her mind wandered back to Daniel. Had they gotten to him too? Was he safe? She couldn't think about that now. She had to focus on getting out, on making sure the evidence didn't die with her. The ropes finally gave way and Naomi's hands were free. She rubbed her wrists, the skin raw and tender, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. She reached into her shoe, pulling out the flash drive and clutching it tightly. Now she needed to find a way out. She crept to the door, pressing her ear against it. No sounds from the other side. She turned the handle slowly, praying it wasn't locked. To her relief, it opened with a soft click. The hallway outside was dimly lit, lined with more crates and boxes. She could hear voices in the distance, but they were faint. She moved quickly but quietly, her senses on high alert. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound made her jump. She needed to find an exit, but the warehouse was a maze. She turned a corner and froze. A security camera was mounted on the wall, its red light blinking ominously. Had it seen her? She ducked back, her heart racing. If they knew she was loose, they'd be on her in seconds. She needed a distraction. Her eyes landed on a fire alarm mounted on the wall a few feet away. It was risky, but it might buy her enough time to escape. She took a deep breath, then sprinted to the alarm, slamming her hand against it. The sound was deafening, a shrill blare that echoed through the warehouse. Immediately she heard shouts, the sound of running feet. She didn't wait. She turned and ran in the opposite direction, her legs pumping as fast as they could go. The warehouse seemed to stretch on forever, but finally she spotted a door marked Exit. She burst through it, the cool night air hitting her face like a slap. She was outside, but she wasn't safe yet. The warehouse was surrounded by a chain-link fence, the gate locked. She glanced around, spotting a gap in the fence a few yards away. She ran for it, squeezing through just as the door behind her burst open. "There she is!" a voice shouted. Naomi didn't look back. She ran, her feet pounding against the pavement. The streets were empty, the industrial area deserted, at this hour. She needed to find help. But where? Her phone was gone, taken by the men in the warehouse. She was alone with nothing but the flash drive and the clothes on her back. As she turned a corner, she spotted a payphone. It was old and rusted, but it might still work. She ran to it, fumbling for change in her pockets. She had a single quarter. It would have to be enough. She dialed the only number she could think of, Daniel's. The phone rang once, twice. Then a voice answered. "Hello?" It was Daniel, but he sounded different, strained. "Daniel, it's me," Naomi said, her voice trembling. "I'm in trouble. They took me, but I got out. I have the flash drive, but they're after me. I need help." There was a pause on the other end, and then Daniel's voice, low and urgent. "Naomi, listen to me. You can't trust anyone. Not even me. They're everywhere. You need to disappear. Now." The line went dead. Naomi stared at the phone, her mind reeling. What did he mean she couldn't trust him? Was he in danger too? Or was he part of this? She didn't have time to think. The sound of approaching cars made her snap back to reality. She dropped the phone and ran, the flash drive clutched tightly in her hand. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew one thing: she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she was so close. The stakes had never been higher. The men chasing her weren't just trying to silence her. They were trying to erase her. And if they caught her, the truth would die with her. But Naomi wasn't going to let that happen. She had come too far, fought too hard. She would find a way to expose them no matter what it took. The question was, could she stay alive long enough to do it? Naomi's legs burned as she sprinted down the dimly lit street, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of car engines roared behind her, headlights slicing through the darkness like searchlights. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. Her only focus was on putting as much distance between herself and the men chasing her as possible. The flash drive in her hand felt like a lifeline, the only thing standing between her and the truth being buried forever. She had to get it to someone who could help, someone who couldn't be silenced. Up ahead, she spotted a small convenience store, its neon sign flickering in the night. It was the first sign of life she'd seen since escaping the warehouse. She darted inside, the bell above the door jingling loudly. The clerk behind the counter looked up, startled, but Naomi didn't have time to explain. "I need to use your phone," she said, her voice urgent. The clerk hesitated, but the look in Naomi's eyes must have convinced him. He nodded toward an old corded phone on the counter. Naomi's hands shook as she dialed a number she hadn't called in years. Her cousin Marcus, a journalist who had made a name for himself exposing corporate corruption. The phone rang once, twice, and then his voice came on the line. "Marcus, it's Naomi," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm in trouble. I have evidence that could bring down a major airline. But they're after me. I need your help." Marcus didn't hesitate. "Where are you?" he asked, his tone sharp and focused. Naomi gave him the address of the convenience store, her eyes darting to the window. Outside, the cars had stopped and she could see shadowy figures getting out. They were closing in. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Hurry, Marcus. Please." She hung up the phone and turned to the clerk. "Is there a back door?" she asked. He nodded, pointing toward a narrow hallway. Naomi didn't wait. She ran through the store, bursting out the back door just as the front door of the store slammed open. She could hear shouting behind her, but she didn't stop. She ran down the alley, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know how much longer she could keep this up. At the end of the alley, she spotted a parked car, its engine running. The driver's side door opened and a familiar face peered out. It was Daniel. Naomi froze, her mind racing. He had told her not to trust him. Was he here to help her or to finish what the others had started? "Get in!" he shouted, his voice urgent. Naomi hesitated, but the sound of footsteps behind her made the decision for her. She jumped into the car and Daniel hit the gas before she even had the door closed. The car screeched down the street, the men behind them shouting in frustration. Naomi clutched the flash drive, her eyes locked on Daniel. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "You said I couldn't trust you." Daniel's jaw tightened as he focused on the road. "I know what I said," he replied. "But I couldn't let them get to you. Not after everything. I've been trying to take them down from the inside. But it's not enough. You've got the evidence. You're the only one who can stop them now." Naomi stared at him, trying to decide if she could believe him. But there was no time for doubt. The sound of another engine roared behind them, and Naomi turned to see a black SUV gaining fast. "They're not going to let us go," she said, her voice tight. Daniel nodded, his hands gripping the wheel. "I know. That's why we're not running. We're ending this." He swerved the car onto a side street heading toward the heart of the city. Naomi's mind raced. What was he planning? Before she could ask, Daniel pulled out his phone and handed it to her. "Call Marcus again. Tell him to meet us at the courthouse. We're going public. Tonight." Naomi's eyes widened. "Are you crazy? They'll kill us before we even get there." Daniel's expression was grim. "Maybe. But if we don't do this, they'll keep hurting people. We have to try." Naomi took the phone, her hands trembling as she dialed Marcus's number. She relayed Daniel's plan, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Marcus agreed immediately, his voice filled with determination. "I'll be there," he said. "Just stay alive until then." The courthouse loomed in the distance, its grand columns lit up against the night sky. But as they approached, the black SUV roared up beside them, slamming into the side of their car. Naomi screamed as the car spun out of control, crashing into a lamppost. The airbags deployed, and for a moment everything was a blur. Naomi's head throbbed, but she forced herself to stay conscious. She could see the men from the SUV approaching, their faces twisted with anger. Daniel groaned beside her, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "Naomi," he said, his voice weak, Take the flash drive, run. I'll hold them off. Naomi shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, I'm not leaving you. But Daniel's eyes were fierce. You have to. This is bigger than us. Go. Naomi hesitated, but the sound of footsteps made her move. She grabbed the flash drive and stumbled out of the car, her legs shaky but determined. She ran toward the courthouse, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind her, she could hear shouting, the sound of a struggle. She didn't look back. She couldn't.